we humans, at least to the best of our knowledge, are currently the only universal explainers and constructors. Part of our mission really needs to be to always be seeking better explanations.
A lot of these things that we in mainstream science take for granted, we keep saying they're established, they're really not. We don't have a mechanism to explain this, so it's impossible. So it can't be true, which is really just a cop-out and not how science works at all. Science is actually just a bunch of stories. When I run an experiment and I collect data, people think it's objective, but it's not, because when I'm looking at the results, I have to come up with a story to write in the paper to convince the journal to publish it.
We need to be very, very humble and think that we really don't know everything.
Mysteries are okay, and it's okay to say that we don't know everything.
Well, hello, everybody. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with another episode of Infinite Loops. I am very excited about today's guest. Mona Sobhani is a cognitive neuroscientist and the co-founder of Exploring Consciousness and author of Proof of Spiritual Phenomena, a neuroscientist's discovery of ineffable mysteries of the universe. Wow. Welcome, Mona.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So I am absolutely fascinated in the attempt of people who have been trained in traditional sciences, like yourself. I've had Rupert Sheldrake on as a guest as well. And I read a lot about this, but tell me about your journey from being kind of a scientific materialist to investigating what some would call frontier science, others would call pseudoscience, which is a term I'm going to ask you about whether we should even be using. But if you don't mind, take us on the journey from trained neuroscientist, scientific materialist to frontier scientist.
Absolutely, my pleasure. So I am a traditionally trained cognitive neuroscientist. I got my Ph.D. From USC. I studied psychopathic traits because I love psychopaths. And I was very much a scientific materialist. That's how they train us. They train us to believe that the universe is random, it's dead, it's meaningless. And especially in neuroscience, they train you to believe that the brain creates all meaning, that our brain looks for coincidences and then create stories to explain the things that are happening in your life. And I totally bought into that. And I think when I went into grad school, I was a bit more curious about the universe. But by the time I graduated, which was 6 years later, I joke now, they don't call it indoctrination for nothing. So by the time you leave, they've had their way with you. And a lot of the magic that I thought could have existed in the universe was definitely stamped out. And I was never spiritual or religious to begin with, but by the end of that, I was arrogantly and condescendingly anti-religious and anti-spiritual, which is kind of common in science. And there's a great stigma to not really talk about that kind of stuff, to the point where later in my life, when I get to that point in the story, when this started coming up for me, I realized I did not know if any of my scientific colleagues were religious or spiritual or had experienced anything anomalous, because we never talked about those things. So I was living this typical scientific life, and it was a series of events. There wasn't like one thing that happened, but after I graduated and started working, I sort of started having an existential crisis immediately because I think after you're working towards a PhD, you're so focused on that, you have a goal. And then when you graduate and you're working and there's no clear goal, and for someone who's like a type A overachiever like me, I thought I just suddenly felt like a void. And the questions of existence that I never bothered with started to flood in. Like, why are we here? Is this all we do? We go to work every day. We don't have time for anything. What is the point of all this? And from my training, the answer was there is no point to all this, and it's your job to find meaning and make meaning out of it. And that was hard to do. So I started having a crisis, but I'm Persian, and my parents are from Iran. They came before the revolution, and we have a tradition in our culture of divination, which is essentially using some sort of medium like tarot cards, or in my grandmother and my mother's case, they would use Turkish or Armenian coffee grinds. It's like a thicker coffee. It's not like American coffee. You leave the grinds in the cup, it creates pictures, and then you can have somebody look at the pictures and tell you about your life, past, present, and future. And so my grandmother was trained in it, and she was very good. Apparently, I never got a reading because she lived in Iran. And so my mom was trained in it, and this would happen all the time in the background of our family parties. And it wasn't on my radar at all. You're a kid. And if it's something you grew up with, you don't even notice it. So I didn't notice, but I mean, our family friends would line up to get readings from my mom. And so when I was in graduate school, I started to go home on the weekends to visit my parents, and my mom started reading coffee for me. It wasn't like a on purpose thing. It just started happening. I would drink coffee with her, and then she would flip the cup over and start telling me things. And of course, at that time, I wasn't into it. I didn't really believe in it, but she would do it anyway. And so I noticed, though, over time that the things that she said started to come true, and with startling accuracy. And it was things that were really intimate things in my life, things that were private that I wouldn't normally tell her, like that I would actively actually try to keep from her, and she started to see those, and I started to wonder about it, but it would have shattered my world to think about it more deeply. So I just ignored it and lived in cognitive dissonance until I couldn't. What happened was I had two big emotional events. So one was my mom saw, one day she was reading, and she just said, "I just have to tell you," and she never said anything like this. She's like, "I just have to tell you, I think you're going to get bad news." And she's like, "I don't want to scare you, and I don't want to say what it is, because what if I'm wrong?" But she's like, "I've been seeing it for a while, and I just feel like I have to warn you." And so, of course, I panic, because at that point, I had been getting the readings for many years, and I knew that she was more right than she was wrong. And if she says something like that, I was like, "I guess we'll see." But I lived on edge for 6 weeks, because every week I went home, she was like, "Yep, it's still there." And she'd be like, "Have you gotten any news yet?" And I'm like, it was a terrible 6 weeks. And then I found out that one of our professors at USC was killed by one of the students, and it was someone I had worked with on one of my dissertation experiments. Sorry, I still get emotional. And so it was a really unusual thing that happened at USC, and it was very upsetting, obviously, just in and of itself. But I think the fact that my mom had predicted it, even though she wouldn't tell me what it was, for 6 weeks in advance, it really threw me into a bit of a crisis. Because I think before that, everything she predicted were like little things, like don't lose money, make sure you pay your bills, you have a good opportunity coming. But this was life or death. And she had never said anything like this before, so it really, really rattled me. But I was too fragile at the time to think about it. And so I had started a new job, and it was really busy. I was moving through the grief of that experience. So I just kind of ignored it. And then 2 years later, I was in a relationship, and my mom saw, unfortunately, every aspect of our relationship in the coffee. But she kept saying it was going to turn out well, or it was going to be good. And then we broke up. And so then I was like, what went wrong? What happened? I don't understand life. I don't understand the universe. And I felt like, I was already having this existential crisis. And it's just like a number of things. I guess I just wasn't happy. And that was like I think of it as the last leg of the stool that was knocked out. And I just had a total crisis of I felt despair for the first time. I lost hope for the future. I thought life was meaningless. And I had never experienced that before. So it was like a double. I was upset about experiencing it, and then also upset going through it. And so it was just my first dark night. And what happened was I was just in that dark place for a while, but then I'm from Los Angeles, and I have a group of girlfriends. We grew up together, So they were like, let's go to a psychic. We know this woman, she's really good. She'll turn you away if she can't read your energy. So I thought, whatever, I'm at the bottom of the barrel. Let's go. I don't believe in this, but let's just see. So I went, and long story short, the woman blew me away. She knew things there's no way she could have known. Like, she would get things from my past, and she would write up multiple variables. And she didn't know anything about me. Like, you wouldn't even give your name. And so she kind of blew me away. And that started my interest in this. And I started thinking, I guess at the time I wasn't ready to look at my life yet or myself. So I was more like, let's look at these weird readings. Like, what do they mean about the universe? And I started going with my friends. We would get readings. We would swap them because we're like, if they're generic, we should be able to swap them. And they should be true for each of us, but they weren't. They were specific to each of us. And so we did this for a few months for fun. And I wasn't reading anything spiritual or reading anything at all. I was just kind of living, and it was percolating in my mind in the background. And then finally, I was listening to a podcast. Chelsea Handler, the comedian, had a podcast, and she used to be a skeptic. She had just written a book. And on her podcast, she had a psychic medium on named Laura Lynn Jackson. And I was surprised because Chelsea was such a skeptic. And so they start talking about reincarnation and soul lessons and psychic phenomena. And Laura Lynn Jackson talked about how she lets scientists record her brain. And of course, I'm a neuroscientist, so I got really excited about that. And so it was like the podcast episode that changed my life. It really got me curious. And they mentioned a book, Many Lives, Many Masters, on the book, which is about past life regression. I ordered it, not knowing what it was about really, read it. And then that was the book that changed my life, because it's about a psychiatrist who's skeptical, atheist, Yale and Columbia trained. And he ends up having this career in past life regression because he's like, it works. And there seems to be something here. So that launched me on my, hold on, let me go order all the books I possibly can and sit and read everything. I went to research mode, which I'm really good at, and just dove into everything. And then my world started to get really turned upside down from there. So, and the whole time I just kept thinking, I was resisting the whole way. My ego was like having a total meltdown, which would continue for years. But I kept thinking, if I'm curious about this. And if I don't keep, I'm always going to wonder, and also it was the first thing in a long time that fed my soul, that made me feel like when I was reading these books, I had tingles up my spine, and I hadn't felt that in so long. So I thought, this is the first thing in a long time that's made me curious and excited. And I just have to follow that. So I did. And then eventually I read enough evidence that I thought it would be unscientific to consider alternate models. I don't think, and by the end of it, I was like, I don't think we have it all figured out, at all. I think there's a lot of mysteries. And it took me a long time to accept that that's okay. That mysteries are okay. And it's okay to say that we don't know everything.
Wow. Amazing arc there. If I was going to play the role of the scientific materialist here, I would simply say, well, this is a subjective, anecdotal, individual experience that you've had. I started my career as a teenager as a professional magician. And one of the things I got trained in was doing cold readings on people. And and then I would also throw in, where's the reproducibility? Where is the adherence to the scientific method? I'm sure you heard that directly from a lot of your colleagues. And I'm interested, what was your response? How did you sway them or get them to try to be a bit more open-minded about the fact that we probably need to have models that evolve and that we don't know the answer to everything right now?
Yeah. Well, I never try to convince anybody because I know that if you're not ready, you're not going to be convinced. But so I ended up writing the book on my experience. And the only reason I wrote the book is because I found so much evidence. So yes, the story I tell is my story and it is anecdotal. But I also like to remind people that anecdotes, even though science, it is this kind of like trend or automatic response we have now to say something is anecdotal. But, in the medical literature, case histories are some of the biggest discoveries. And we publish those because they're important, because even if one person has it, it's something. It may be an anomaly and maybe one data point, but it's not nothing. So, and there's usually hints, and it opens doors to more discovery. So case studies, anecdotes are important. That's how we explore things. The other thing is I did find a ton of scientific evidence. So when I started reading the research, I was reading books and stuff, but eventually I started reaching out to interview intuitives and mystics myself, and then interview my scientist colleagues to ask those questions finally of like, do you guys believe in a higher power? Has anything weird ever happened to you? Like it has to me. And they all had stories. Everybody had a story. And they were all way more open-minded than I thought they would be. And it was really nice. It was like a nice bonding experience to see, oh my gosh, we're actually human. Like we're not just scientists. And so I reached out to the scientists too that had done the studies. So I connected with all these amazing people who've done this research. And then I read the research myself. So it turns out that there's over 100 years of research on psychic phenomena. And it's been conducted in every continent, all these countries, hundreds of labs, hundreds of thousands of participants. And when I read the studies, I was blown away because they use some of the protocols that we use in neuroscience and psychology, like literally the same ones. And I know statistics, so I read the stats. They were totally legitimate. So that was the turning point for me, was reading the science and saying, okay, well, now I really can't ignore this, because this science is just as good as any of our other science. If we ignore this, then we have to throw out a lot of our other science, because it's the same standards. So, and psychic phenomena research gets really scrutinized. It's combed over with a comb. Like it's just, people tear it apart, and other sciences too, but not as much, because we have mechanisms to explain that. And so their studies are actually better controlled than a lot of our studies, because our studies don't have to be as controlled as theirs. So I found that the science was solid. And I think the only reason it's not indexed on Google Scholar. So that's something I found. Someone told me that and I didn't believe it, but it was true. I had to type in quotes, exactly the name of an article to be able to find it on Google Scholar. If it was weird, like if it was in the journal of the Society for Psychical Research or something like that, it was hard to find. So it's hard to find. People don't know about it. And then even if you force them to read it, there's no physicalist mechanism that we are aware of. So that's how some skeptics will, brush it off and say, oh, we don't have a mechanism to explain this, so it's impossible. They'll say it's impossible. So it can't be true, which is really just a cop-out and not how science works at all, because there's a lot of things we don't understand or have mechanisms for, and we don't just throw them. We might put them on the side until we have a mechanism, but you don't just ignore it, right? Like a good scientist would say this is an outlier, but it exists, and how does it break our model? And how do we need to update our model to make this work? But, mainstream science isn't interested in doing that right now. So it's a shame.
So I'm a big fan of people who've looked into this in depth, many scientists. One of the things that I find really interesting is that, from Einstein to David Bohm and on, Schrodinger, you find that many of them, especially in their later years, became basically mystics. Which I find really, really fascinating. I wonder if you've ever read the book by Robert Anton Wilson called The New Inquisition, Irrational Rationalism and the Citadel of Science.
Ooh, I haven't read that one, but I'm definitely writing that down.
I think you might enjoy that. And also, just recently, I was revisiting the work of Michael Polanyi, who was a polymath and scientist. And he had an idea, really two ideas. One was that we humans all possess tacit knowledge that we are not necessarily aware of. And he furthered that with the idea that maybe we should build into the scientific method, which I distinguish from scientism, right? Which is because, any article you read that says, according to science, I really usually insert according to scientism, which is itself kind of a form of a religion. But he had this idea of that we should establish personal coefficients for scientists. And what he meant by that was every scientist goes into their research, even using the very rigid scientific method, right? With a package of beliefs, biases, intuitions, personal experiences that the individual scientist brings to his or her research. Mm-hmm. And he felt that the fact that we weren't adjusting for that in some way was a very limiting factor to the scientific method. Have you established some protocols that you could easily share with even the most skeptical of scientists out there? Let's say a colleague who's a neuroscientist who was like, "Hey, I love you dearly, but boy, I just don't believe this." Have you come up with a series of protocols that you could share with that individual where they could run them and go, "Oh my God, like, wow."
You mean like an experiment they could do themselves?
Exactly.
That's an interesting question. I don't know that I do talk to a lot of them. I've opened up a lot of my colleagues. We started off our conversations with them constantly. I would be excited and share something, and then they would knock it or whatever, come back with an automatic response or some alternative explanation. And then eventually a lot of them ended up going to get readings from my intuitives, and then they would call me to discuss. So I think, I've noticed the pattern is you meet with their resistance, their ego wall. And I don't even take it personally. I know everything is about them. So if anyone's aggressive, I know it's not even at me. Even if it's being directed at me, it's not about me, it's about them. And I understand that their ego is trying to protect them. So I try not to take it personally, but that took a lot of self-work, to be honest, to release my anger and my defenses, because I was like that. So I know where it's coming from. And I also know that you could tell me anything, like at the beginning of the journey, no matter what you said, I wouldn't care. I wouldn't listen because it wasn't about that. It was about keeping myself safe. So I understand that. So when I interact with people like scientists who are skeptical or resistant, I intuitively just try to get a sense of where they are and try to meet them where they are. And then based on where they are, I might make suggestions. And a lot of it starts before you get to the really weird psychic stuff. It'll be like when you wake up in the morning, starting to get them in touch with their subconscious, which is an easier way to talk about this stuff because it is tied into your subconscious, a lot of this. So just saying in the morning, doing Juliet Cameron's Artist's Way morning pages is a good way to see what's going on in your mind right when you wake up and you're in kind of a sleepy state. So I start to talk to them about doing things like that, or doing maybe a meditation, but a guided one where they ask for guidance and see what they receive. So something like the Hemi-Sync from the Monroe Institute is a good one to get them in touch, because that one works pretty well for people, even people who are not usually open. If they do it a few times, they'll be like, no, I really got an answer to my question. I'll be like, see? And it, the thing with science, and this was my problem in the beginning too, but now it's not, now I understand it's a problem for people who are coming to this, but they'll be like, but is it my subconscious or is it a spirit guide? And they need to know the difference. And there comes a point where you don't care. It doesn't matter anymore. But for a scientist, that's hard. And that's something tricky. That's like a tricky thing to navigate with them. And I always just tell them it's whatever you want it to be. Whatever makes you feel better, then just say that's what it is. Because the truth is, we can't take this into a lab. and figure it out. At least not right now. I think ultimately maybe, but not right now. So it's like, it doesn't matter. So yeah, I mean, there's little things like that. If I have a huge bibliography that I can give them, if they're interested in reading books, I'll buy them books, send them books. And I read tarot for now, so I'll read tarot for them. And a lot of times they'll just be blown away by that. And I mean, I wouldn't say they're convinced, but I do think that every little one of these things opens them a little bit more and more and kind of brings them, back in touch with themselves, which I think this is all about.
So one of my interests is in looking for people.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say one other thing before I forget that a thread, you mentioned the filters that each of us bring to as scientists. So I was having dinner with Allison Paradise, our mutual friend, last night, and we were talking about this. We're talking about science is actually just a bunch of stories. So anybody who does science, like us scientists, when I run an experiment and I collect data, and then people think it's objective, but it's not, because when I'm looking at the results, I have to come up with a story to write in the paper to convince the journal to publish it. And the story I choose, even though scientists probably don't think about this and wouldn't admit it, but that story that you choose is influenced by who you are and what lab you come from, right? And so it's like you have a million possibilities of stories you could write in that paper, and the one you choose is biased by who you are and your experiences.
Well, that would also feed into the quantum physics findings that particles exist in a superposition of potentiality until they're observed, and then they have definable characteristics, right? So, from an infinite group of stories, you as the individual scientist are observing and picking one, right, that then has definition and everything else. But back to the idea of establishing some sort of bridge. I don't know whether you've read C.P. Snow's The Two Cultures, which looks at the separation of philosophy and the arts and science that happened around the time of the Enlightenment, and also sort of Michael Polanyi's idea that you've expressed, that you're telling me about your personal coefficient, and I find it really interesting if we could come up with a set of protocols, right, that would be acceptable to both sides. So, for example, you're probably aware that Princeton for decades had a unit that they didn't talk about very much, but it was essentially looking into all of the phenomenon that you are describing here. And there are literally truckloads of data from those decades of the Princeton group that investigate this. And I'm just wondering if I asked you to come up with a series of protocols that could somehow bridge the gap between scientific materialism, i.e., the world is dead out there, the universe, and our brains, not our minds, account for all of the phenomenon that we understand. Like, how would you go about that? What would you do?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is, are you familiar with the spoon bending parties that used to happen?
I'm familiar with the magician who used to go on the old Johnny Carson show. Can't recall his name right now, but that he did the spoon bending thing.
Okay, so so I don't know if I was down in attend one, so I don't know. But there was this engineer. His name was Jack Hoke, Houck, I think. He used to work for one of the defense companies out here in California, but he was interested in all this mind matter interaction. He's passed away, but he had this website, which is pretty interesting. So what he used to do was he would invite a bunch of people together to have a spoon bending party, and he developed a protocol for it. You can find it on his website. I tried it myself. It worked. So, but you would get a bunch of people together, give them a spoon, and then he gave the instructions. And I don't remember them exactly because I read it a few years ago, but it was something like, you focus your energy here and you move it down your shoulders to your arms. to the fork, and then you tell the fork to bend, or the spoon, sorry. And you tell it to bend and, focus, concentration, da, da, da. And these parties, it works because people get distracted. So to the mind matter, the basic protocol is you focus intently, you have to have a kind of a good mind practice to keep your attention on something, focus, concentrate, give a command, and then let go. And the part that everyone has problems with is the letting go. So he said the party environment allows that letting go to happen, where people get distracted. They'll see someone's spoon bend and they'll look over and be like, oh my God, their spoon is literally bending by itself in the air. And then their spoon will start to bend. So he would have these parties all the time, and they even had it on a TV show once. I wish I could say I've been, but it was in the 70s or 80s when I was a baby. So he used to do this, and I think that's really interesting. And I think Lauren Lynn Jackson actually does that at some of her workshops for people to prove to them, because then it's not somebody showing you, it's you doing it. And they even give you like the spoon, you can try to bend it beforehand, and you can't. It's impossible. It's like really strong. And then when you watch it melt in front of your eyes, it kind of blows your mind. And so the U.S. used to fund for 25 years a whole research program into psychic phenomena, and they used to do this exercise with high-level government officials to prove to them and to show them what they were working on. They started implementing this in high-level meetings to be like, here's an example of what we're working on and how nuts this is. And because a lot of times the higher ups would not be on the same page, or they'd be like, why are we spending millions of dollars on this program? Like, what are they even doing? So they would have these private, closed door, closed blind meetings to be like, this is what we're doing. And then they would be blown away. So that's one way I could think of. Another one, actually, that's interesting. I saw this it was in a workshop, maybe from Lauren Lynn Jackson, maybe from someone else. So all of us have these innate abilities. And for these workshops, sometimes you can come with a personal item, and there's strangers there, no one knows you, and you swap items with the person, and or just, it doesn't even have to be an item, but it can be an item. And you kind of just, they tell you close your eyes, meditate for a while, and jot down anything you see about the item or about the person. And when you do something like that in a group, or you're doing it with just two people facing each other, you find that some people will see, whole scenes, and that turn out to be related to the person's life. So I'm trying to remember an example. There was like an example, a woman the person gave her, I do not remember the item, but the images she saw, she was like, there's an older man, there's a boat, there's something about a birthday, like they're handing you something, a key, it was like a whole scene, and it turned, and a wheelchair or something. And it turned out like that the woman's grandfather had been in a wheelchair, came over like to America in a boat. And like something that was significant about that was he brought a key with him from his home country or something. And so it was like a whole story that was relevant to this person's life that this complete stranger picked up out of literally thin air from an object. So when you do these kinds of interactions with people, you start to see, you walk away with this personal experience of like, how did I know that? How was I able to say, like 10 variables and build a story and tell it, and it's actually relevant to this person's life, and it's not, a generic story that's common to everyone's life. So I think that kind of personal experience, which I started with Allison doing science and spirituality retreats because I wanted to, it's like what convinced me was scientific evidence, but the personal experience, it's both, for I think people in this age, it has to be both. And so it's like, one, let's summarize some of the science for them so they don't have to do it or go look for it. And then second, let's give them some personal experience so they can walk away, understanding that we don't really understand reality the way we think we do.
Well, I can certainly endorse the statement that we don't understand reality the way we think that we do. I completely agree. By the way, the name of the magician who did the spoon bending on Johnny Carson was Uri Geller. Now, he was famously debunked And I wonder, just taking that example, and also, again, from the Princeton archives, there was a lot of information, if my memory serves, about intelligence agencies here and elsewhere doing experiments with remote viewing, where they would have people who seem to be quite adept at it do that for them. And apparently, according to my last check-in on this, some of that was still classified information in terms of the science. But let's stick with the spoon bending parties. Isn't there a way to create a protocol where you would do, I don't know how many, you're the scientist, you tell me, but like where it could be captured on video, it could be looked at and done in a variety of locations. So, for example, Bell's theorem of non-locality. Basically, it was posited as a thought experiment until they could actually test it using scientific instruments and prove it to be true, which is really interesting. But what I'm trying to get at is a lot of people who are you mentioned that you were fully indoctrinated. There's a great line that is, my indoctrinators were very convincing because they themselves were fully indoctrinated. And I just wonder, though, if one of those bridges would be a creation of protocols that everyone could agree on, right? So we're going to have 100 spoon bending parties all around the world. We'll have controlled environments where we simply record what goes on in all 100 of those parties. See what I'm getting at? I'm wondering if there isn't some way to make it, because when you're arguing from like, yeah, I was there and I saw it, people can easily, especially materialists, right? Can just say, well, sure, yeah, that happened once. You have no proof of it. Is there a way? For example, we're working on developing testing if people have intuition, and if they do have intuition, can they improve that intuition? We're working on that with Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, who I admire greatly because, boy, did they try to crucify him. But he continues to publish, and even when he gets null hypotheses, right, he publishes that too. And he follows a very disciplined scientific method approach. And that's what I'm trying to get at here. Do you think that there could be a series of protocols that could be more acceptable because they were done under, uniform conditions?
So I think we could try, but so I'm jotting notes because there's a few things you hit on that I want to comment on. So the first is this phenomena, in my opinion, does not always lend well to to being measured by the scientific method, but it may just be because we don't understand it that well, but it may also be because it's not predictable and repeatable when you need it to be. So Jeffrey Kripal, who's a professor, actually the chair of religious thought and philosophy at Rice University, he writes about this a lot, that sometimes these abilities are unleashed or enhanced when you experience trauma. And sometimes when the craziest stories you hear are like, someone wakes up at 3 a.m. and they see their child or like the ghost of their child in their bedroom, only to find out the next day their child died at 3 a.m. And so it's like these really traumatic emotional events sometimes that cause these experiences to occur, and you cannot replicate trauma ethically in a laboratory. So that's one thing. The fact that the remote viewing has been, we've been able to study it and replicate it and have great statistics on it is fantastic, but all of the experiences may not be able to measure them in that way. But the other thing is, whenever you have a human in an experiment, and then when you have a lot of humans in an experiment, there are so many unknown variables about the dynamics of the interactions with each other that, yes, I think it would be great to do what you're saying, especially across space. But and you could try it. And the thing is, if it's a large enough effect size, you'll see it. But if it's a small effect size and it's influenced by different variables like people's personalities or their group dynamics, it might be washed out. And I wrote about this in my book because that's the tough thing about a human-centered phenomena like this. But the interesting thing is there's been some research from Dr. William Tiller, who used to work at Stanford. He was a material scientist, but he was super into this stuff. So in his later years, he started doing all these experiments. And he had a whole model for it, a physicalist, I think, ish model. But yeah, using intention, so focused intention, and then measuring the pH of water changing. And then he would measure the whole environment, the temperature of the room. And IONS, the Institute for Noetic Sciences, still does experiments like this because they're, the how much electromagnetic radiation is in the room matters, like the temperature, if people have access to the room and can come and go, like all of those things matter. So he started setting up these controlled experiments showing that if you do a focused intention, and he even created a device that could record the intention and you could put it in a room and they would measure the pH of water in the room versus a separate room with no intention machine. And they saw that it worked, that it would increase the pH of water in the room with the intention machine and the other one didn't. And they did it across countries or across labs also and found the same thing. So there's been some of that done in the research, but not enough to convince anyone because this research is not funded. And the protocols, can probably be improved, but the Institute for Noetic Science is working on some of that. And I agree, though, we do need more of that to convince people, especially more recent research. And the problem is, I often tell people, you're working, for scientists to a lot of scientists want to study this. They're interested in it, but there's no money in it. They're going to risk their reputation, their stigma. They have to grapple with their ego, all the people in their social life. And then there's no funding. So it's you have multiple barriers to getting people to do this work, which is extremely unfortunate because I think it's the most interesting.
Yeah. And I try to take as pragmatic a view about these phenomenon as possible. And so I'm very interested in all of it, but I'm also at the same time sort of naturally skeptical. And not that I would go out of my way to try to disprove it, but I definitely think having a series of protocols that different scientists, right, different people investigating the phenomenon could always use the same protocols, right? And then we could get some kind of meta-analysis of, okay, do we have evidence for this or do we not? Do we have limited evidence, et cetera? And that's an area that I find really interesting and compelling. And look, the history of science is littered with examples of people who, David Bohm again, right? His implicate and explicate order idea was actively suppressed by his mentor Oppenheimer, not because of the science involved, but because of politics. Essentially, there's a great film on Bohm in which letters that Oppenheimer had sent to people said basically, if we cannot disprove David scientifically, we must ignore him. And so, that goes on all the time. And we tend to, the layman, at least like me, tends to think of, science and, it's absolutely does not have any of these human biases or whatnot, whereas it's filled with them and people trying to actively suppress a theory. By the way, Bohm's theory went on to be proven correct.
Yeah.
And again, referencing Dr. Sheldrake, many of his ideas, I found a BBC thing before recording his podcast where the editor of Nature, the most prominent British scientific journal, Sir Maddox, is on tape basically saying no, this man's a heretic. He should burn. Like
Oh my
literally,
God.
he's on video saying that. And then, of course, many of Sheldrake's hypotheses proved to be correct. So
Yeah.
I'm always very interested when I'm talking to people trained in the sciences, which I'm not. I'm just have a layman's interest in them. But like trying to find the protocols, I think is something that I would certainly support. That is, here at O'Shaughnessy Ventures, we give grants to people, fellowships, and like someone trying to establish a series of protocols that anyone could use to investigate these phenomena seems pretty interesting to me. I wonder.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, as a scientist, so I was thinking about some of the blocks I had when I was coming into this based on what you're saying. And it was that. So it's funny, you come in from the materialist perspective and you're like, reality must fit in my materialist box. Like this phenomenon that is under question it must be repeatable. I must be able to measure it. I must be able to, describe it. I have a mechanism for it. And, there has to be an explanation in the physical universe. And you put all these boundaries around it. And like this, like you have to write a protocol that everyone can use, which is, of course, where we have to start because that's where we are. But after you start digging into this, so especially from a neuroscience perspective, in neuroscience, the biggest question, the biggest mystery is consciousness. And the thing that really opened the door, besides the scientific research for me, like that opened my mind to, because even when I read the scientific research, I kept coming up against a wall of, but how? What's the mechanism? What is the method? And then it wasn't until I hit philosophy, which you mentioned pseudoscience at the beginning. So I actually wrote an article a few months ago because this controversy came up in neuroscience about consciousness. But I was arguing that pseudoscience, to some extent, is like the artificial boundary between philosophy and science. Because now in mainstream science, they're like anything that's outside of materialism, like anything that's panpsychist or anything that falls into philosophy, we ignore it. And it's not science, it's pseudoscience. And that's a false dichotomy. I mean, that's new. They've just decided that that's the case in the last few decades, but that's not how science was before. The natural sciences were philosophy and science. And so from a neuroscience perspective, you're like, consciousness must be produced from the brain. That's the materialist perspective. And of course, that's definitely the perspective I had coming into this. And that's where I was like, how could your brain know someone else's thoughts? Or how could I know the future? But then you hit philosophy and you're like, oh, wait, no, it's not settled. Scientific materialism is not the definitive answer. It's just one that we have settled on for now because it's been the most useful, but that it's possible that consciousness is an energy, that it's one of the foundational principles of the universe, and that maybe it, bubbles down into whirlpools that turn into people and then goes back into the pool when we die. There's all these other explanations that once you hit philosophy, you're like, oh, the box of materialism is just blown open. And you're like, I don't have to be bothered with these constraints. This is ridiculous. Like, why would I sit in this box? I don't have to sit here. There's so many other explanations. And so then when you go back to talk to a scientific materialist, sometimes it's frustrating because they'll, keep insisting on X, Y, and Z. And you're just like, oh God, please read a philosophy book. Like, we don't have to do this. But yeah, so but I agree that we just aren't there yet. I mean, that is something else that I'm working on is pushing consciousness education into neuroscience because they never teach you this. They never say, hey, number one, day one of neuroscience, the assumption in our field is that we live in a physicalist universe, but that has not been proven. And that is an assumption we make. That's something they never tell you, and they should.
That's the classic example of the planted axiom, right? Lewis Carroll, who was trained as a logician, actually wrote a very short piece, but very compelling, called What the Tortoise Said to Achilles, in which he basically proves that when you take a logical system that is based on axioms, right, that if you continue to say, let's keep going down, how do you know A is true? Well, because B is true. Okay. well, B is true. How do you know B is true? Well, because C is true. And he goes through this in the essay, and what he ends up with is the assertion that at the bottom of all of these axiomatic logical constraints, there is the primary axiom, the base axiom, if you will, that basically he maintains a human simply asserted this is true. In other words, without any proof. But I'd like to move on to consciousness, because that's an area that I am absolutely fascinated by. And the idea that, for example, Tesla, the scientist, he believed that our brains were actually receivers, not the originators of the ideas, but rather a receiver that collected or that connected to what Jung would have called the collective unconscious, right? And obviously the physics and metaphysics did get separated. You're right. But so I'm not a traditionally religious person at all, and yet as I investigated this idea of consciousness, I was struck by the ancient religious or spiritual traditions and how they might actually all be saying the same thing. So, for example, if you look at Brahman and Atman, right? So Brahman was infinite consciousness who created Atman and then did a trick on him and cut his memory that he was in fact Brahman. And then he created infinite Atmans and to see if he could learn anything new. But then you start going and you go, whoa, wait a minute. That tradition is very similar to Taoism, which essentially says the unnamed Tao is the mother of all things. You could definitely read that as consciousness. And then the one that kind of surprised me the most was going into Christian religion and the assertion of I am in the Bible, both New and Old Testament. In the Old Testament, Moses goes up and talks to the burning bush, right? He goes, "Hey man, who are you?" and the voice answers, "I am that I am." And then I start looking at all of the I am statements in the Bible. You know, I am the light of the world. I am the way of truth. I am the Alpha and the Omega. These are all New Testament type things. But if you start thinking about it as in not I am, but I am consciousness, right? Mm-hmm. You can reconcile all of these things to a degree that I would have thought were very, very different. And yet they're all kind of saying the same thing. You know, I am the door, I am the way is another quote from Jesus, that is what Taoism is, the way or the path. And I wonder though, like, doesn't this just always land back in metaphysics? I guess the exception that I would like to discuss with you next is quantum physics, right? So David Deutsch, in his book, The Fabric of Reality, says there is a unity of knowledge, and that this unity of knowledge it informs all explanations for the world, and that, you know, it's all interconnected, right? And then again, in quantum, they actually have proven through the scientific method that things are non-local, that there is an observer effect, that there are particles existing in multiple states simultaneously until observed, and then they take on defined characteristic, quantum entanglement and information transfer, right? Yeah. Have you ever looked at trying to borrow from some of these hypotheses that have been tested and proven out in quantum physics and bringing them over into biology and other disciplines?
Yeah, there's for sure. So I think also when I was encountering this stuff, I think so Dean Braden's work really, when I read some of his books, it started to make a lot more sense. Everything started to click into place, and because they're all related. So you start with psychic phenomena and you're like, how could that possibly happen in a physicalist universe? Then you encounter the philosophy that there's other possible ways the universe could exist. It could be physical and not physical. Consciousness could be the foundation. And you think, okay, but that's philosophy. Like we can't test it. But then you encounter quantum physics and you're like, oh, wait, some of these ideas, like you said, that sort of like a perennial philosophy, a thread of truth that's woven through many of the religions and cultures of the world comes down to, being, like you said, being proven in modern labs in quantum physics. So a lot of these ideas that they encounter in the spiritual and mystical and religious texts suddenly in the 1900s starts being proven in a lab. And then, but then we have people, we just haven't proven it on the human level. I mean, although I beg to differ about that, but if I'm just being scientific, we haven't proven that on the human level. Is it possible? So there are some mainstream scientists like Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose. Roger Penrose is a physicist and Stuart Hameroff is a neuroscientist. They have a theory for quantum mind. So proposing that there are parts of our brain, because the general assumption is that quantum effects, biological systems are too warm for quantum effects because they usually require very cold environments. So that's been for a long time the argument that nothing quantum happens in biological systems, but now that's being disproven in multiple ways. I mentioned some of them in my book, but there's, but Hameroff and Penrose have proposed a theory saying, no, there's like these these proteins in our brain called microtubules. They have some sort of quantum, properties. So they're able to interact with quantum space. And maybe that's how we're able to, some of these psychic phenomena stuff that we've been talking about, maybe that's how we're able to access a broader field. Maybe it is that the brain is some sort of filter that filters in consciousness, like from a wider consciousness. And when you start to think of it from that perspective too, these phenomena don't seem impossible anymore. As soon as you widen your perspective and you think, oh, like, no, there's just like there's a whole pool of information up here, a whole field that contains everything, and you can like tap into it, tap out of it. Oh, that makes sense now. And that's what, quantum physics is showing. You said things aren't non-local. I mean, there's even some showing time, right, doesn't necessarily flow forward in one direction like we thought that it does. A lot of questions about time coming up. Oh, as Donald Hoffman, another neuroscientist, loves to say, space-time is doomed. So with the new physics coming out, space-time is doomed. So a lot of these things that we, in mainstream science or physicalism take for granted, we keep saying they're established. They're really not. And it is a very odd thing to watch in science, because if you flip over to a quantum physics journal, it's like a different world versus when you flip over to like mainstream biology, because they're living in two separate worlds. There is starting to be a crossover. Like I said, like Hameroff and Penrose is a good example, but they're just one. There's a lot of research being done, also with light. So like there was this really interesting proposal, like a theory that was put forth that consciousness is filtered in, that there's a field, maybe an electromagnetic field or some other kind of field of consciousness, and that it has different, frequencies or states, and that when we put our brains in certain states, it lines up with that, and you can download. And the person who wrote the paper, his name is Kepler, Joachim Kepler. He wrote a few papers on this to explain consciousness and memory in humans, and he kind of described it as like a read-write system. The brain's like a read-write, like read, write, put it back to so it's a continuous back and flow between the brain and the field. And he mentions being able to measure it possibly with biophotons. So biophotons are also this like whole new field. There was just a discovery that neurons communicate with biophotons, which we did not know. We thought it was only with but it's electrochemical, it's both. But now it turns out it might be light. So as well, which is new. And that there's, I think, some research with cardiac, also using light to heal cells. Skin, of course, that's why you see those red light masks that all the women are wearing to regenerate. So there's a lot that's coming up. And light, of course, is a photon. And that's what's used a lot in a lot of quantum experiments. So it looks like there could be links. It's just starting to happen. I think the bridging of those fields is just starting to happen.
Yeah, Penrose, of course, very famous for Penrose tiling, which is an interesting phenomenon in and of itself. And I as I listened, though, I'm also reminded, I don't have it in front of me, but reading about the Z point field in quantum physics, where essentially, if you take a group of particles and reduce the temperature to absolute zero, you would think that there could be no motion, but there is in fact motion. And so
that's what the field is from the theory, the 0 point field. Yeah.
Yeah. And that also informs Dr. Sheldrake's work of the morphogenic field, in which he basically posits that that humans and all animals actually have this idea of a cloud, much like we have the cloud that we send all of our electronic data to.
Yeah.
He posits that that these clouds exist naturally in the universe, and that we go back and forth. My interest is continually ignited when I read about this stuff, but I always kind of come back to the idea, gosh, wouldn't it be cool if we could come up with protocols, methodologies, et cetera, that would bridge these disparate ideas and claims? Because I think that the challenge, the way I see it at least, the challenge is that orthodoxy has such a just iron grip on the way, for example, science gets funded, the way a variety of these things happen, that you just wonder, could you see or could you contemplate a breakthrough that would even have the as Wilson calls them, the irrational rationalists in the citadel of science go, holy shit, we better look into this?
Yes. So what I was thinking of is I'm interested in technology. So, I mean, some of my background is working with digital health. So I'm interested in how technology can help us get into these transcendent states in a more reliable way. And I'm interested in psychedelics too. So I wrote a whole substack on psychedelics, publishing about the science, just because it's like emerging and related. But I think psychedelics is not going to be for everyone, right? They're like, you never know what you're going to get. So not everyone's willing to take that. But I think transcendent technology is really interesting, and I think is one of the most likely ways that you'd be able to, as you're suggesting, reliably get into these states. So there's all kinds of different technology, but so one way to reliably put you in a really good deep meditative state is you wear these like glasses, and it's like light and sound entrainment. So it puts you quickly into a deep meditative state. And I think in those kinds of conditions, instead of leaving it up to the person to be like, hey, get into go do a meditation, go access something, come back, tell us what you saw. I think that kind of technology, the more that we can fine tune it for people too, because I do think that everyone has different baseline brain states, right? That's what makes us who we are. Those are our personalities. Those are our thought, patterns. Everything's different for different people. So it will vary. So I think that would be really interesting to start doing that and studying that. And like, what do you need to put you into a deep meditative state, or like the best meditative state to receive? And maybe, something like remote viewing, because remote viewing was, I think they would give, and you could do way better things now, but the CIA would give them coordinates, just literally like 3 numbers, like they're just coordinates, and they would have to say what they see, and they would compare it. And obviously we could come up with better items instead of like a broad location, but it's some sort of better experiment to do that. But then you'd probably be more likely to get better results if you can get people into that state instead of relying on natural talent. or their natural abilities, which is highly variable. But if you could start to use technology and then start to fine tune it to make it personalized, that would be super interesting.
Yeah, we are actually investors in a company called Prophetic, which is developing, they hope, a technology that would put the mind in a state where lucid dreaming would become far more common across, as you put it, people with different states of mind, I guess we'd put it, and it would allow just everyone using this device that they're developing to experience lucid dreaming, not only experience it, but potentially control it. We find it very interesting. One of the things that I find interesting is that as an offshoot of their research, they're finding all sorts of neurological implications for medical and other uses for this particular technology. So I definitely agree that pushing the edge of tech could lead to findings that might be the eureka moment, as it were, for even the most dyed-in-the-wool materialist. But you also bring up psychedelics, another area that I'm deeply interested in, because I, like everyone raised, I'm 63. I was born in 1960. And in 1971, Nixon was in a lot of political trouble. And so he decided he would distract people by launching a war on drugs. And the drugs that he really was launching the war on were psychedelics. And like anyone else, I bought the propaganda. I never tried a psychedelic. I thought that they would fry your brain and everything, until I read Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, looking at psychedelics. And I was completely unaware that there was volumes, warehouses full of research on psychedelics compounds and their efficacy in treating things from post-traumatic stress to addiction to depression to all of those things. And so that really opened my mind to the idea that here was scientific research that was meticulously conducted, by the way, that was completely suppressed and essentially burned. And I commend Michael Pollan for bringing this to at least to my attention. And then I find that there are groups like MAPS, which is an organization which sponsors scientific investigation into psychedelics, and of course is supporting the Johns Hopkins look at how psychedelic compounds can assist our veterans in the United States with post-traumatic stress syndrome. And I'm fascinated by the idea that there are these huge bodies of research that existed and for whatever reason were suppressed. And now we're kind of rediscovering them. Are there others that I'm unaware of that you could share with me?
Well, first of all, I love psychedelics, if you can't tell from it. I can use psychedelics actually to tie everything that we talked about together. So psychedelics, I was never interested in them either. I was a type A, like control freak. I'm like, oh, there's no way I would touch that. Hallucinogenics. And similar to you, I wasn't familiar with the new research. I didn't know they were beneficial. So, but while I was interviewing people for the psychic phenomena stuff, this is very, very early on. So before I hit any of the philosophy or consciousness, I was still a baby in this field. I interviewed some of the, like I said, the researchers who had worked for the government program, and they asked me, they're like, have you looked into psychedelics yet? And I was like, why would I look into psychedelics? And they're like, some really weird stuff happens on psychedelics, like paranormal stuff. And I was like, what? So they're like, just go read. So I went off and started reading, and they were right. First, like you, I dug into the modern day research, and as a neuroscientist and someone who's interested in mental health treatments, I was already blown away just by that. I was like, how on earth could LSD help somebody get better from depression or anxiety? But it does, and it did. And there was a lot of research on this from the 1950s to the 70s before they were banned. But then I dug in deeper into the, Aldous Huxley, oh my gosh, why are their names eluding me right now? Whatever, that whole group. There's like a whole group of them. What's his name? Gordon Wasson. So these people who kind of brought psychedelics to the forefront of American consciousness starting in the 50s, and it's kind of not talked about. And I've noticed this because I've been in the psychedelic scene for the last few years, but it is talked about in certain rooms, but the transpersonal paranormal aspect is kind of hush-hushed because, they're trying to make it a medical treatment. They're like, oh, yeah, don't bring that in. Everybody will, run out of the room screaming. But at some point, they can't ignore it because a lot of times the mystical experience or the entity encounter is what, based on the data, causes the highest amount of healing. And so they can't ignore it for forever. And it's already starting to pop up in the literature. But it's really fascinating. So on psychedelics, you get people, saying, actually similar to what you were saying, like, we're all one, it's all love. We are an expression of consciousness. We're here to learn. And, on these substances, they can come back feeling like, I know the meaning of life. I met the divine. I felt the sacredness. That reality was more real than this reality. And they all say very similar things. And a lot of weird things can happen. They can have visions that, again, turn out to be true. Like they see, let's say a spirit appear to them. And it turns out that it's somebody that they know who passed away, that they didn't know was going to pass away. They get messages from people who've crossed over that turn out to be true. Back in the 50s, when the psychiatrists were using LSD, they actually wrote this whole protocol that I love. It's very interesting. They talk about how common it is to feel like you are actually feeling the other person's emotions or thoughts. And they call it, telepathy. They're like, basically it's enhanced on psychedelics. And this is all to the point where I think it was Andrea Puharich and like somebody else, they actually tried to do, and this is anecdotal, but they're like, let's give you a psychic phenomena test. I forgot who took it. And then we'll put you on psilocybin and then we'll have you do it again. That's an experiment I want to see today. I want somebody to do that. But they did that with only one subject and it was like not official. But it was to the point where they were like, yeah, this stuff is weird and puts you in a state where you can get information. So they're like, let's test to see if it enhances psychic abilities, which many people believe that it does. And so like, that's something that we could test for sure. And now there's being, a lot of, DMT Quest is another organization that's focused on using the molecule of DMT, which is a psychedelic, but which is also just a naturally occurring molecule in our bodies, kind of using that as a linchpin between materialism and these other worlds, because it does seem like DMT is a particularly potent psychedelic where if you inhale it, it only lasts 15 to 30 minutes, but you're somewhere else. Like you are in another dimension. You're like with aliens, elves, fairies. Like you're getting information. You feel, it's like geometric shapes, fractals. It's a whole other world. But what's interesting is people come back saying that world was the real world, and this is a dream. And so we can use DMT and, actually, well, there's not that much known about DMT, but my friends there's an institute here in Santa Monica, Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies. They're raising money for a study they do ultrasound. So you could do ultrasound to activate the pineal. And they said it gives you like a DMT-like experience. But they're trying to raise money to do a full-on study for that because there really hasn't been a lot of research on DMT, but people cite it as the link between spiritual dimensions and the physical dimension. But we should definitely look into that a little bit more, I think.
Yeah, that's the area where I'm actually most interested. If we could organize, catalog, and demonstrate some empirical evidence from these disparate studies and from the different experiences that, like you've just described, the DMT experience, I've read lots of interviews with people, and they do, in fact, have very similar stories about that particular experience. And then you look over and there's a legitimate school of thinking in quantum physics that there are infinite universes, the multiverse, etc. And then, of course, different levels of dimensions, right, that we need to explore. It's maybe just the quant in me that would love, because I'm very open. I'm very open to these ideas, and that's why I love having people like you on the podcast and exploring them. But there is that quant part of me that is like, okay, all great, but show me some empirical evidence that crosses a variety of these studies that can lead us to evolving, right, the scientific method. Because I completely agree, and this is just speculation on my part because I don't have any, not trained in science, etc. But I would definitely be interested in funding those kinds of things where you're trying to get empirical evidence that these things warrant further investigation, right?
Yeah.
So what's next for you, Mona? What are you working on right now, and what are you excited about currently in your endeavors?
Well, I wrote the book, and I had a Substack for a while publishing about psychedelics, which was just like you said, like when I found out how beneficial they were, I thought, as a public service, I'm just going to start writing summaries of the research in really easy to understand ways so people can understand why this is so significant. And since I was coming from neuroscience, I was like, I feel like I can explain why this is really important, because there's very few other mental health modalities that we're seeing comparable effects with. So I started doing that. And then early this year, I transitioned to a new Substack where I'm writing more about my personal experience. Well, first of all, I'm summarizing more of the science of these anomalous things. So like I want to do a more comprehensive deep dive and then summarize it in easy to understand ways so people can have access to it and understand the implications of what this means. Because I think sometimes that's lost on people. And then also talking about my experience. So flipping from a scientific materialist to being open-minded was hell, was very hard. I'm still working through it. It was the worst thing that has ever happened to me. And so I'm writing about that now, about how difficult it was. There's some of that in my book, but it's actually, sadly, there's much more to come after the book published. So I'm starting to write about all the challenges that I have encountered that were unexpected, and how I've had to work through them, just because I really do believe that as the psychedelic renaissance takes off and as more people are doing contemplative practices, more people are going to flip worldviews, as I call it. And it is not easy. It is not easy. And they're going to need a lot of support. My gosh, I'm getting emotional again. Sorry. But it's hard. And so I'm starting to write about that. And I'm also interested in, as we were talking about, looking into the research. I'm really interested in healing, like light and sound and frequency healing, because the body is energy. I mean, every protein vibrates at some level. And I just don't, like, I'm just constantly curious about, is there any evidence for this? Has anyone even looked at this? What are the gaps in the literature? What do we need to fund and study to get some of this going? Because materialist science has been very focused on chemicals, hence the pharmaceutical industry, but we don't have to be. The body is electromagnetic and chemical. So there's a lot of other things we can look into. So I'm interested in looking into that. There's, a lot of people claim sound and light can heal you, but I'm interested to know if that's true.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. And of course, that goes all the way back to Pythagoras, who believed that music could have healing properties. And so what I find fascinating about this entire discussion is that if you jump down the rabbit hole, you'll see that we've been discussing these ideas. Again, I mentioned Pythagoras, Heraclitus, a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher who essentially posited that the entire world was a mind and was one thing. And my interest, of course, is again, back to my kind of quant-like attitude. I would love to provide financing to studies that actually sort of take all of this and all these different points of view into account, and then try to look with an open mind at the idea that, of course, we're not there with a, in quotes, final theory. Again, Heraclitus basically, everything is in a state of becoming, right? The world is not stasis. Stasis is death. Movement is life. And the more that we can reconcile that with traditional science, by the way, which I'm a big fan of, like, traditional science has given us amazing, amazing things.
Yeah.
And so I'm not at all trying to oppose it. I'm much more interested in enhancing it. And I think that there are pathways, like your notion of non-invasive therapies, light therapy, the red light therapy you reference, well known. I've listened to people talk about building harmonic wave resequencers where they are able to resequence DNA. And again, I love the idea that we are really kind of just at the beginning, right, of understanding all of this. And I think that just reminding everyone that we need to have, as far as the epistemology of it, we need to be very, very humble, and think that we really don't know everything.
Absolutely. And I would also say one thing that I don't want to make this point. When I was a hardcore scientific materialist, I lacked a lot of compassion because science kind of, honestly, there's no humanity in science. I feel no qualms about saying this. Like, becoming a scientist, I think, honestly strips away parts of your humanity. And I've had to reclaim those. And I think, which is fine. And I'm with you, though. I love science. I'm just saying, it's a cost for the profession. It doesn't have to be. It just is right now. And I feel like what we lose when we approach things from a skeptical, aggressive stance, which I used to do, by the way, I'm basically talking about old me, my old self, is you lack that human component of this person who's sitting opposite me has had an experience that clearly has affected them deeply, that they believe. And who am I to tell them that they have not? Who am I to tell them that their experience is not valid? Because when it comes back to consciousness, all we really know is our own experiences. So for that person, it's true. And I always mention this to scientists, the one thing you could do, you don't even have to be open to anything. The one thing you could do is just be a little more open to listening to someone talk about their experience and being open to their experience. You don't even have to believe it. You just have to be open to it.
Yeah, I guess I subscribe to David Deutsch's idea that we humans, putting the human being back into the scientific process, we humans, at least to the best of our knowledge, are currently the only universal explainers and constructors, and that part of our mission really needs to be to always be seeking better explanations. And if you just look at it that way, which I think is so brilliant, a book that I always recommend. My friends tease me about this all the time because I tell everyone they really need to read all of David Deutsch's books. But he in his books, he constructs a wonderful scaffolding for building these ideas and understandings into the process. And bravo for bringing humanity back. I'm all in favor of. I often say that we need both Sparta and Athens, right? And sometimes we create these false dichotomies that very deterministic worldview. And my point is, we live in a probabilistic universe, not a deterministic one. And it is at our peril when we try to reduce it down to through definitions, as you mentioned earlier, to a kind of a logic box that, as long as you're subscribing to all of those axioms in that logic box, you're really kind of blinding yourself, maybe unintentionally, but blinding yourself nonetheless. Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. I think you might know that at the end of our podcast, Infinite Loops, we wave a magic wand and we're going to make you the Empress of the world. You can't kill anyone, you can't put them in re-education camps, but we can give you a magical microphone in which you can say two things. And the effect it will have is that the next day, or whenever the next day is for the 8 billion plus people living on the planet happens to be, they're going to wake up and think, I just had two of the greatest ideas. And unlike all those other times that I woke up with these great ideas, I'm actually going to act on both of these ideas. What two things are you going to incept in the world's population that you think might make it a better place?
I think this is just on my mind. I think personally, it's been on my mind this week. It's this. It's treat yourself the way that you would treat one of your best friends. Like talk to yourself the way that you would talk to, or treat your actions. If you had a friend who messed up, what would you say to them? That's what you should say to yourself, like every day. I think that a lot of us don't realize how harsh and critical we are of ourselves. And when you're that way on yourself, you're that way with others too. So I think that would solve a lot of problems. So that's the first thing. And honestly, this is so lame, but it's honest. But this has been my personal mantra for even before I was a scientist, was be kind. Because I just honestly feel like if everyone is just a little bit kinder to people, because every time that you're kind to somebody, it opens your heart a little bit as well as theirs. And I don't know, I just think our world needs a lot more of that. So kind of simple.
I love both of them. The first is the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and then be kind. And it's so funny because in the United States, at least, in English, at least, I think that people conflate kindness with being nice. And I think that they're two very separate things.
Oh, definitely.
Being kind, it costs you nothing, and it can do such wonderful things in the world. So I completely subscribe to both of those inceptions. Mona, thank you so much for taking the time on a Saturday. I really appreciate you adjusting your schedule to help me. This is fascinating stuff, and I wish you the absolute best in your adventures going forward.
Awesome. Thank you. It's so nice to meet you.